Hello, this is Melvin McLeod. I'm the editor-in-chief of Lion's Roar, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second of my conversations with Jon Kabat-Zinn. Jon, as we discussed yesterday, is generally recognized as the founder or inspiration for the mainstream mindfulness movement of today, and I think it's fair to say is still its acknowledged leader. Jon, thank you very much for joining us today for the second of these conversations.
My pleasure, Melvin.
So, what I'd like to do today is to look at Jon's personal journey and influences that led you to the creation of mindfulness based stress reduction, which is, I think, generally recognized as the first step, as the origin of what came to be known as the secular mindfulness movement, and some of the choices that you made in defining that system or that framework, which remain in many ways the foundation of the movement to this day. After that, I'd like to start to discuss some of the specifics of mindfulness practice and of mindfulness, as well as some of the controversies and questions that revolve around it. So, Jon, looking at your own personal journey, I think it's fair to say that you're a person who had at the time a a, a, a deep interest in, let's, for lack of a better word, spirituality, as well as a deep professional scientific background,
Hmm.
both of which, in the end, came to bear in the creation of mindfulness based stress reduction. So maybe you could tell us a bit about your influences, your proclivities, your choices, your questions personally that ultimately led to the creation of MBSR.
I'll do my best, and I'm very aware this is a kind of caveat that whenever you tell a story, especially about yourself, um, it's obvious that there are 50 million ways that one might tell the story, depending on what kind of effect one would like to produce in the listener. And so I feel like the stories themselves are always suspect in a certain way, incomplete, tilted or slanted towards um, maybe some degree of romance or just sort of consistency or coherence. And so I'd like to just sort of preface this by saying, don't believe anything that I say. I mean, it's like it's one more story of me. We all have multiple ones, and it's not that they don't have some value, but they're not the entirety of what's actually so. And what I hope to point to as I go along is that deeper element we started talking about yesterday that has to do with transcending one story and basically taking up residence in what I was calling the superpower of awareness. So that said, my experience of formal meditation practice or even learning about it, casually happened one day in 1960, late 1964 or early 1965. I don't exactly remember, but when I was walking down the halls of MIT as a graduate student, the Vietnam War was just heating up. The Gulf of Tonkin incident had happened. I was a student in molecular biology in the laboratory of Salvador Luria, a Nobel laureate. And I was pretty depressed out of my mind with what was going on with the Vietnam War. And of course, this was, uh, you know, the 60s and the prelude to, other things happening in the 60s, including, the assassination of John Kennedy in '63, but then Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy later, after this moment in 1965, when I'm walking down the halls of MIT, and then I see a sign on the wall. The corridors of MIT are like the Pentagon; they go on forever. And I saw this sign on the wall. I was heading out of the building, the main entrance of MIT on Mass Ave. The three pillars of Zen: talk by Philip Kapleau at the invitation of Houston Smith, who was a professor of philosophy and religion at the time at MIT. I had never heard of Houston Smith. I'd never heard of Philip Kapleau, but there was something about that sign, and maybe it was the iconography of the three pillars that's the same as on the original, book. Uh, I went to that talk, which took place around 5 o'clock seminar time at MIT. And, MIT is a community of thousands and thousands of people. Aside from Houston Smith and Kapleau, who was giving the talk, and Houston Smith, who had invited him, um, I think maybe four people showed up for the talk. And I was one of those four people. And Kapleau's talk took the top off my head. And I've written this story up in my book, Coming to Our Senses, which then later on I republished as four different volumes. But that story I started meditating that day, because what he said, and it's interesting in terms of the future with MBSR, which came much, much later, but he told a personal story about, well, he had been at Columbia in the School of Journalism at the very sort of uh, fomenting time in the 40s, and then he became a reporter at the Nuremberg War Tribunal. And of course, there you're hearing testimony about unimaginable atrocities at an unimaginable scale. And so it had an effect on him, and he went off to sit in a monastery, a Zen monastery in Hokkaido, which is the northernmost island of Japan, in the wintertime. And the monasteries have no central heating or anything like that. So you're meditating in the absolute freezing cold. And he had all sorts of body problems, including ulcers and stuff like that. And he was a very, sort of committed, motivated, some would say rigid character. And he said in his talk that after 6 months, his ulcers disappeared, and he felt like his mind equilibrated, following the trauma of the testimony at the Nuremberg War Tribunals, and he found himself in a certain way. And my 21-year-old years at that moment were just like, wow, this is what I've been looking for my whole life. And the reason for that is because I grew up in a house with a father who was a kind of very accomplished scientist at Columbia University Medical School, and a mother who was extremely committed artist, painter, who just saw with a unique set of eyes, a lot like, sometimes I say, she saw like through eyes a lot like Monet. She saw shadows, she saw reflections in windows, she saw in cars, surfaces and so forth. She saw all sorts of, and painted in a whole range of different ways, and used a lot of different kinds of modalities, not just paint, in her artwork. So I grew up in this classical C.P. Snow to culture in the 1950s. Scientist on the one hand, father scientist, mother artist. And my mother never showed her work. She was not like successful in the ordinary form of things. She didn't want to show her work. She sold one painting in her entire life and regretted it. And then when she turned 100, she had her first show as part of a, 5-person show at the assisted living place where she was living. So um, I grew up as a child knowing that there were these different ways of knowing. And my father would go to his lab, and I spent a lot of time in his lab, and I tried to understand what was going on, and looking at all the machinery and the centrifuges and the test tubes, and and the animals that they were using to study the immune reactivity and so forth, developing antibodies. And then my mother, who was like just painting and sketching constantly. And when my father would take her to scientific meetings, when she would go with my father to scientific meetings around the world, um, uh, and it wouldn't be fair to say he took her, but that was the kind of way people spoke in the 50s about it. She was very engaged in that kind of thing. And what she did was she sketched all the scientists and put them in like tons of notebooks, all these faces, and sometimes from the back. And then when they go to concerts, people playing instruments and so forth. So I grew up knowing somehow, without being able to frame it in language, that there were different ways of knowing in the world, different approaches to understanding what was hidden and what could be made apparent through scientific investigation and that kind of rigor, and then artistic, creative insight that's not aimed at a precise reproduction, like in a photograph or something like that, but more like impressionistic. So this was just kind of in my DNA in a certain way. And then when I heard Kapleau speak, that's why I had that thought that I've been looking for this my whole life. In other words, trying to unite the science and the art, these different ways of knowing. And my mother also played the flute, so music was involved as well. And we would go to museums every weekend, and especially the Museum of Modern Art. And they even put me in school when I was 5 years old at the Museum of Modern Art School. So, when I heard Kapleau's talk, it just struck me in no time that this, in some sense, what he was talking about or pointing to was what I've been looking for my whole very short, immature life. And so I started meditating that night and never stopped. Now, that's very unusual because, I mean, I started a lot of things in my life and they didn't endure, even though I thought they were terrific at the time. All sorts of fads that one might get into. But this never fell away.
And yet, um, I think that, albeit that your background or your family gave you the understanding that there was not necessarily any fixed or single understanding of reality, that presumably the experience or reality that Philip Kapleau pointed out to you, that you then pursued in meditation, transcended both the artistic and the scientific background. It was indeed a third way that actually transcended
Exactly.
any form of conceptualization.
Not, I wouldn't say transcended so much as included, so that there was a way of understanding that unified different universes, so to speak, into a much larger whole. And I saw that instantly in a certain way. And then, which was very motivating for sitting meditation. And so, as I said, I started sitting. Now, we probably at some point have to talk about like, is meditation just sitting? Okay. And the answer is no. The real meditation practice is how you live your life from moment to moment. But if you think you can just practice mindfulness in everyday life without grounding it in sitting, it's like thinking you could play a Stradivarius and play Mozart without practicing. In concert, they're both are necessary. At least for me, I feel like getting my rear end on the cushion, literally and metaphorically, on a regular basis for decades at a time, it was incredibly important. And that goes on to this day, although the forms in which one does it change over time. Uh, as you move more and more into that sense that, washing the dishes, as Thich Nhat Hanh used to love to say, is as much a meditation as anything else. Putting away the dishes, everything, waking your children up in the morning. I mean, there are no moments that really are not worthy of being um, inhabited. And that's the real practice. Inhabited how? With awareness, with open hearted, embodied wakefulness. Now, easy to say those words, but actually, it's only the hardest thing in the world to cultivate even one moment of mindfulness, even one in breath and one out breath. And that's where the formal meditation discipline, the rigor of it is really important. And I feel blessed in a way that I was first exposed to it through the Zen tradition. Now, Kapleau was a real, you know, maniac about that. And in fact, we had a fight, right, almost right away, because I wanted to go and train with him and do a 7 day retreat, a session with him. And he asked, there was a certain form that you had to fill out. And I said, well, I do hatha yoga because I'd been doing hatha yoga as well. And and he said, "Oh, if you do hatha yoga, you can't come to the retreat." And I said, "Well, then screw you. I'm not coming to the retreat because the yoga was already in." And I had studied with a bunch of swamis and people who, don't forget, it was Cambridge, Massachusetts. So everybody and their mother was coming through and displaying their wares and so forth. And the yoga, I first learned actually in the karate studio in the Matson's karate studio, Okinawan karate in Boston, and I did martial arts for many years, but the yoga was, they were doing hatha yoga for warm ups, these young Marines that had come back from Vietnam, and I liked what they were doing. I said, "What is this stuff that we're doing? These warm ups?" And they said, "Well, this is hatha yoga. The plow, the shoulder stand, the fish." And I like that a lot better than the martial arts, actually. So I never have stopped doing the yoga, and I don't see yoga and meditation as separate at all. They're different doors, if you will, into the same room.
So, if you had presumably practiced meditation for many years in a Buddhist or religious context, what led you to make the leap to look at that practice outside of that religious framework, and particularly in a scientific framework or in a framework specifically oriented toward benefiting people who were suffering physical and mental ailments? I mean, I would note that the initial story that you were inspired by of Philip Kapleau was when he said effectively after 6 months of sitting, his ulcers went away. So already from the beginning, there was a kind of sense that, oh, this can in very practical, relative ways be beneficial to one's health and well-being. What was the transition for you from then practicing in a religious context to being able to say, well, actually, this could even be extremely effective as well as ultimately more accessible to present it in a scientifically based context that looked at specific benefits?
Well, interestingly enough, I have a kind of allergy to the word spiritual, and I never think of this as religious, actually. Um, Mindfulness is spoken of, and Nyanaponika Thera wrote a book back in the 1962 called "The Heart of Buddhist Meditation," and it's all about mindfulness and the Satipatthana Sutra. And the interesting thing about the Buddhist tradition is there really is no God. Okay, so this is a very different kind of quote unquote religion from God-based religions, and so I felt like, it's more akin to a scientific inquiry, an investigation. That's what meditation is. You investigate the nature of your own mind, not using fMRIs or CAT scans or EEG or anything like that, because you don't have access to that. But what you have access to is another uh, power, so to speak, or another framework for holding experience in awareness, and that is your awareness. And we spoke about that the other day, and so that I consider to be a certain kind of, over the decades, I've come to see it as a certain kind of superpower that's really um, important not to ignore, and that we all already possess. So it's access to it, and the access comes with the sitting, okay, or the walking, or the lying down. There are four classical postures in which one practices formal meditation: sitting, walking, lying down, and standing. So there's nothing that privileges sitting, although often it looks that way, and often I even speak of it that way because it's so powerful. And if you can sit cross-legged, not necessarily in the full lotus, but at least cross-legged on a zafu and learn how to do that, uh, it is incredibly unifying experience where the body is simply surrounded by the air. We're drinking in the air moment by moment, breathing in and out, and the air is also touching every aspect of the skin that's exposed. And then we drop into no time, because one element of the present moment is that time falls away. At least subjectively, the experience of time falls away, and there's just now. So every time you check, if you look at your watch, what time is it? I like the joke. Well, it's now again. You can throw your watch away or just put a sign saying now on it. And we often do that on retreat. We just cover the clock with a now sign. So, as I think we said before, taking your seat in this way is not like, oh, one more thing I have to do in my busy day. This is like if you were a member of the New York Philharmonic Symphony Orchestra or San Francisco or any great orchestra, and you were a violinist. Of course, you'd have a good instrument. And luckily, you're born with a good instrument, okay? Good enough instrument. But then you have to tune it. So they don't just start playing Mozart or Beethoven. They tune their instruments to themselves, and then they tune to each other. And so one can think of formal meditation practice as tuning in to the actuality of the present moment. And it has a very profound effect on what we call body and what we call mind, even though that's dualistic to speak of them in that way, and also world, because we're not separate from the world. We're only one breath away from being dead. And so drinking in the air, you begin to actually recognize that um, we're not separate from the environment. This has lots of implications in terms of uh, climate change and global warming and diet and eating and everything else for humanity. But so, in a certain way, you're discovering a new dimension of your own being that and I feel most of us don't actually encounter or just have tiny suspicions of, and then we get distracted by, our phones or whatever it is. So, to actually learn to rest in awareness with the body in an erect and dignified posture, if you're sitting, or in a complete, like, corpse like pose of surrender to the gravitational field if you're lying down, or standing like a tree and really rooted into the earth and with the trunk elevating into the sky with the branches and leaves. Uh, or walking on the surface of the earth. These are all doors into the very same awareness. So, so from the point of view of formal meditation practice, all of those doors are valuable, and we teach all of them in MBSR. Okay.
So you've just given us a very good teaching on why mindfulness and meditation are indeed universal truths, almost methods that are based ultimately on who we are as human beings and what mind is. But I don't think we can skip over, because I would like to go back to what I consider to be an historic strategic decision. So that practice that you just described for thousands of years was offered in the framework of religion,
Yeah.
specifically in the framework of the religion of Buddhism, albeit that that may or may not ultimately be a religion, and that ultimately, I certainly agree that this practice, this reality, this wisdom is indeed universal and ultimately not religious. But nonetheless, the fact was that it was presented for 2,600 years in the framework of
Very true, very true. And it has all sorts of mystical elements to it and magical elements to it and so forth. Yeah, and devotional elements to it that are really not part of what I've basically introduced into the world.
exactly right. And that so now in this modern society in America, that in many ways that framework is a barrier to people accessing these practices and this wisdom, which are not inherently part of the religion, necessarily part of the religion. So we cannot skip over the fact that you have made an historic, I believe, strategic decision to take the universal truths, to take the universal practice out of the context of religion and present it more broadly and more accessibly. And we cannot. I think I would like you to reflect on to tell us a bit about when that light bulb went off, that okay, this stuff is not inherently religious and in fact could be much more beneficial and accessible when presented outside of the context of a foreign religion called Buddhism.
Well, I second everything you say. I second that emotion, so to speak. And I think it was from the very beginning that, like that first moment of hearing Kapleau speak, I realized that, you know, his experience had a universal resonance with me, and then practicing for, well, from 1965 to 1979 was when I set up this stress reduction clinic, the MBSR. So that's, more than a decade. That it was like a period of simply percolating in my own development with a sangha of people that I cared deeply about. My Dharma brother, Larry Rosenberg, who, founded the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center. I mean, we are like, sort of Dharma brothers for almost 60 years. Um, so it never felt to me like it was religion. I was not interested in religion, but I thought, here is something that has intrinsic value, and that we can offer to people. There was one other element of it that I didn't mention, and that is someplace in there was the thought at some point that the world would be a much better place if everybody meditated. Okay, I mean, if just everybody had a meditation practice, there would probably be a lot less violence and aggression, and greater well-being, a greater happiness, a greater sense of agency, so to speak, because we were tuning the instrument before taking it out into the world to play. And tuning that instrument, especially if you're cultivating non-attachment to the personal pronouns that we spoke about, and the sort of a kind of inadequate or incomplete sense of self or being, then that gives you the freedom to be in much wiser relationship to the forces that we all experience in the world, including stress, pain, and illness. Okay, and since dukkha and is the first of the four noble truths, the first noble truth is the actuality of dukkha, which is translates as suffering, but it's a very inadequate translation. That dukkha is in some sense the kind of dissatisfactoriness of anything that you attach to in a particular way, and and so dukkha, it really has more to do with suffering than it does to do with pain. But if you differentiate pain from suffering, then there's space. And that space can be very valuable when you've had 4 back surgeries and you've tried all these different narcotics and your life is not working the way you want it to. And what about learning something different that you can do for yourself? So one of the insights was early on, before MBSR, pretty much everybody would benefit from the kind of fine tuning that meditation and yoga might bring into one's life. But then the idea was, well, why not bring meditation into medicine? I was already working in a lab at the UMass Medical Center between 1976 and 1979. So a lot of this stuff was percolating then because I was working in a lab doing classical molecular and cellular biology. But I was also turning 35 in 1979 and knowing this was not the trajectory I wanted for myself. And I was also teaching gross anatomy. And, for a yoga teacher, that's why I took the job, because I could actually do gross anatomy with the medical students, which for a yoga teacher is like phenomenal. So I, I reached a point in those years working in the lab where I'm asking, what am I doing with my life? What am I really, really supposed to be doing? What is my job with a capital J on the planet? And so I began to go around in the third year and talk to doctors in various clinics. I talked to the head of the primary care clinic, the orthopedic clinic, and the pain clinic. And I asked them, well, things like, very simple things like, well, what percentage of your patients do you feel you help? And they would say things like, well, maybe 20%, maybe 15%. And I would say, my God, what happens to the others? And they say, well, they either get better on their own and they never get better. And sort of a light bulb went off in my mind. And I said, well, do you think it would be valuable if we set up a clinic in the form of a course and you referred all the people you no longer knew what to do with? Or when you saw them walking down the hall and people told me they did this, you see them walking down the hall, you cut down another corridor because you just don't want to go through this again with Mrs. So-and-so and her heart palpitations or her chronic pain or his this or that. And the head of primary care said, well, I can think of a whole bunch of patients I could send right off. So did the orthopedic guy, and so did the head of the pain clinic. And so I wrote a proposal to the hospital, not to the medical school, but the hospital, saying, what about, a kind of pilot program to test bringing meditation into medicine, since meditation and medicine sound a lot alike because they actually etymologically share the same deep root, which we can go into if you like. And again, I've written about this. But that was the kind of first step, and they let me do it with zero credentials. I mean, just from the point of view of who are you as a meditation teacher? How do we know you're not the worst meditation teacher in the world? Because how would they ever know that? They wouldn't know the value of credentials if you had them. So I said, well, I studied with this particular Korean Zen master. Well, how would they be able to evaluate that? But I did have a PhD from MIT in molecular biology with a Nobel laureate. And so you can see the wheels functioning in people's minds. I mean, I could really see it. Well, he must know what he's doing. So they let me do it with no credentials. And in the Department of Medicine, thank goodness, not in the Department of Psychiatry. And people, these physicians in different clinics sent me the people they no longer knew what to do with. And I felt very trepidatious because, like, the pain clinic sent me all these people who were what they would call failures to treatment. And it's like, oh, send me all your failures. And yeah, of course, I'm trying to make a point that this might be useful. And you're going to send me the absolute hardest people to work with. And it turned out they were the best people to work with because they had no place to go. They had done all the back surgeries and did lidocaine injections and trigger point injections and all that kind of stuff. And they were still in pain. And so they were open to the proposition of, okay, now, instead of turning away from or trying to obliterate your pain, we're going to put the welcome mat out for it. We're going to investigate what is the experience of pain. And then not talking about it that way, but with this sort of sense that maybe they will be able to differentiate that from suffering. And while pain is something that, as long as you're breathing, you're going to have pain at one point or another in your life, how you are in relationship to it makes enormous amount of difference in terms of suffering. And to just say, when reporters ask me, well, give me a one word definition of mindfulness, aside from pure awareness, the other thing I say is relationality. How you are in relationship to the actuality of things matters. And that's something where you have enormous degrees of freedom, but you have to exercise the muscle. You have to learn how to do it. We all do. And so that's how it got started. Those three people, the head of the pain clinic, the orthopedic clinic, and the primary care clinic, sent me, maybe in some 15 or 20 patients. We had 2-hour classes once a week. And I basically realized, well, I'm going to have to invent guided meditations. And how you do a guided meditation for people who had no interest in meditation? They were just, the doctor told them to come. How the hell am I going to get them to actually practice? And it turned out that in those days, there were cassette tapes had just been developed. And most people didn't even have cassette machines, so we had to get them to cassette machines in some cases. But I made some recorded guided meditations. And because so many people were in chronic pain of one kind or another, or disabilities, the first meditations were lying down meditations, not sitting meditations. And what I call a body scan, which I developed out of yoga, my yoga teaching and so forth, and a combination of that with the kind of Goenka like body scanning that they do, only starting from the feet and going up to the head rather than starting from the head and going down, in part because the head is like the biggest source of thought and reactivity. So why not start with the toes and the bottoms of the feet? So I don't want to go on and on about this, but by um, teaching people the sort of basics of meditation, and then sending them off with their tapes for the first week, and then they come back, and then we meditate together without any conversation at the beginning of the second week class. And then it's like, well, how did it go this week trying to do the tape 6 days a week? The homework was to practice 6 days a week with that body scan. One day off for good behavior, but you have to choose which day it's going to be. And the stories were remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And people began to discover aspects of being that they had kind of pushed off into some corner, and began to, in some sense, re-inhabit the body and trust, in some sense, the mind. And then to listen to other people, because we do this in a circle and everybody's carrying dukkha. That's like, it's a dukkha clinic. So then you realize, oh, my dukkha is not the only dukkha. You listen to Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so, and you go around the circle of 25 or 30 people, and you hear, excuse me, some subset of the human condition. And then you realize, well, maybe I can live with what I have. And then the question is, how? How? And so you trust the practice. You go back to the practice. You investigate how it is in the body scan when you come to the most problematic part of your body that's usually in pain, and you open to it as opposed to close off and run away from it. And see what happens, and what happens in the mind. What are your thoughts in that particular? What are your emotions? What are the actual nociceptive sensations? And then you can ask that question we touched on last time: is my awareness of any of this really suffering? And all of a sudden you discover there's a whole hidden dimension of experience called awareness, where you can hold this in a way that's intrinsically and immediately free. Not for long, because, we drop back into not being so aware and falling more into thinking and emotional reactivity. But then you can exercise that muscle, move back into awareness through intentionality. So it's attention and intention working together in some kind of yin yang kind of synthesis or melding, that people begin to They learn from the practice. They're not learning so much from the MBSR teacher. And the MBSR teacher, and this is the hardest part of being an MBSR teacher, is that you can't teach out of a curriculum or out of a book or out of a protocol, although there is a book. I wrote a book about it, but you have to teach out of your own practice. You have to be fully embodied yourself to whatever degree that's possible. Warts, pimples, and everything. So it's not pretending I'm, an enlightened being or the Buddha, but no, I'm just here with everybody else. I'm breathing, you're breathing. We all have bodies. We're all going to die. But before we die, what about, can we be alive in this moment? And when people are related to in that way, they kind of recognize that they're being accorded a certain kind of agency, or their agency is being recognized. It usually isn't in medicine, where you give up your agency and you're just supposed to follow the instructions of your doctor. So it was very liberative on a lot of different levels. And then I realized, this is the last thing I'll say in this sort of segment of it, that if we didn't document what was going on in the room, it would be hopeless, because it would just be a nice set of stories and anecdotes. But if we wrote scientific papers about what was going on and measured people's, bodies in one way or another, and their anxiety and their pain, and reported it in the scientific literature, then it might have a much larger impact than just in the room in one hospital. Maybe this has the potential to kind of spread in the world in a way that only science would allow it to do. And that turned out to be absolutely the case. And if you track the number of papers on mindfulness in the scientific literature over time, and I can hold up a graph of it if you'd like to see it. Let's see if I can get that right. So this is 1982 when I started the stress disorder. You can't even see that the first papers is like one paper, two papers, no papers each year. And then all of a sudden, around 20 years after we started, it starts to go exponential, and it's still going exponential. And now there's there's a journal since I think 2012 called Mindfulness, and so it's become a legitimate scientific field to actually study um, meditation within the context, not merely medicine, but now psychology and all sorts of other domains of human interaction. And it has actually moved into the mainstream. Now, at what depth, that's a whole other question, because we're talking about the heart of this being non-dual prajnaparamita practice. And not every MBSR teacher would even recognize the words prajnaparamita or know anything about the Buddhist origins of this and how insanely powerful and beautiful they are, going back to, the Buddha himself. And then in the Zen tradition, the Chan tradition, um, Tang and Song Dynasty China, where the articulation of this non-dual practice was offered to the world in ways that, through stories, through koans, through all sorts of other kinds of things, they're just totally remarkable. And while you can't teach any of that as an MBSR teacher in the class, you better know it. You better breathe it. You better have some kind of deep connection to this Dharma that's really universal and infinitely deep.
Well, thank you, Jon. You've told us a remarkable story that started with one class attended by four people, with or class lectured by with Philip Kaflo at MIT.
Well, you never can tell when something's going to influence you.
No, you can. And through 10 or 15 people who were suffering physical pain to now millions of people practicing this. And I have one quick question before we segue a bit into the next part of our discussion. But, you said, even going back to your initial encounter with it, that you recognized that in what Kapila was talking about was universal truths or methods that could be widely beneficial, that were not inherently religious or Buddhist. And then you work to create MBSR, specifically working with patients in a narrow way, and now ultimately leading, however, to millions of people practicing mindfulness. When you were effectively creating mindfulness based stress reduction, but still ultimately aspired to making the practice available much more widely. Did you see the specific MBSR program as the first step in that, ultimately being able to spread as it did, or were you simply doing what you were doing and
No,
hoping?
no, no. I saw it from that first moment. I saw it right away, which was the motivation to write scientific papers documenting what was happening, and partly because I understood in some deep way, because of my upbringing, how science worked, and how you can create new fields if you have interesting evidence. And it doesn't have to be totally conclusive. It needs to be suggestive enough that other people would be willing to devote some of their own precious investigative time in labs or clinics to seeing whether that might be helpful or useful or even career promoting, which is not the best motivation, but I'll take any kind of motivation, to get it launched, and then it self-regulates after a while. It's not like I'm, leading this movement. This is a self-actualizing, non-centric, uh, flourishing or flowering of what I would call universal dharma in the world. So, so that was the intention from the very beginning. And I feel like the fact that medicine and meditation do share the same deep root meaning, it was like the ideal environment to do it in. But it's also really important to teach it in schools and to teach it at every level of, education, because people are embodied, and yet mostly we're treated as if we're just heads walking around on, sort of robots. And now with, sort of the dawning of the AI world and universe, um, we need to have a much deeper appreciation of our analog genius, which we haven't even scratched the surface of as human beings, and not abandon that to the merely digital because it's so seductive and addictive.
So tomorrow we'll talk more about the future of human society and hopefully the role that mindfulness can play in that. I'd like to segue now to begin a discussion about some of the specifics of mindfulness, and uh, and I want to put a proposition to you of my understanding of mindfulness. So we have in a way a kind of standard definition of mindfulness that I know goes back to the way you have formulated it. It could be put in different ways, but it's often described as um,
Well, let me say it.
judgmental
Yeah,
awareness.
let me say it. Okay, since I know what you have in mind. My working definition of mindfulness is the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non judgmentally. And then there's a whole other sort of couple of sentences if you want to have some reason for doing this paying attention, but usually that's not part of the definition.
Right.
But that's maybe the motivator. The biggest motivator is suffering. I mean, just like the Dharma. So it has to do with paying attention, and but without judging what you're experiencing, but just holding the entirety of experience in awareness. And to do it in a way that embodies interest and investigation. These are some so-called enlightenment factors, but that embodies um, basically a love of life, that it's a love affair to actually enter into the present moment and fall awake as opposed to go on autopilot.
I'd like to posit that really there are two parts to this practice, albeit that it's one practice, we can divide it into two, which is that I feel the key is that we need to have a relatively stable or uh, undistracted mind in order to be able to look in a clear way, in a stable way, at a non-judgmental way at what we are experiencing both internally and externally. And therefore, there are two parts to the practice. The first part could be called concentration. It could be called stabilizing the mind. It could be called focusing the mind, quieting the mind. And then, having quieted the mind sufficiently, one can look in a non distracted way at reality clearly enough to see its true nature, both of one's own. So, in that way, sometimes mindfulness is understood as simply the first part of that equation, which is basically you're quieting the mind, you're stabilizing the mind, you're focusing the mind. And many of the critiques of mindfulness are based on that partial understanding of the practice. But to my mind, the real payoff comes in what one sees when one applies that focused, undistracted mind to the nature of reality, to one's own being, to the reality that one experiences externally, to
Yeah.
what causes suffering and what causes that the insight we can develop by applying a stable mind to looking clearly at reality is the true transformative power of the practice.
Agreed. A- Except that that's a very dualistic framing of it, and it's classically done that way, of course. But the danger is that MBSR is only 8 weeks long. Okay, and people are not motivated for the usual reasons people are motivated to go to, retreat centers and Buddhist centers and learn something about the Dharma. So you've got 8 weeks basically to actually cover the entire distance, which is infinite. Okay, so a dualistic approach of dividing things into, say, concentration and insight, while it's classically, spoken of in many ways, this is where the non-dual Zen approach becomes really essential. That we're and because if people get off on the wrong foot meditating, and I've seen this in people who are meditating in the Buddhist tradition, 30 years later they're still on the wrong foot because of a fundamental misunderstanding on day one. And that is that, when you're meditating, you're trying to get somewhere else. And if you have an annoying pain in your knee, you're trying to ignore it or get rid of it or whatever. And this is a kind of fundamental misunderstanding that the invitation is to go drop in to the actuality of experiencing right in this moment with things exactly as they are, and then just be at home to whatever degree you can. And then you discover that degree is very limited because you're going to react instantly with thinking, with emotion, with contraction in the body, with not liking, not wanting, impatience. Why am I meditating? I'm sure this isn't what I'm supposed to be feeling. And this is exactly what you're supposed to be feeling. The curriculum here is you're supposed to be feeling whatever it is that you're feeling rather than trying to feel something else that would be better, no matter how painful or sort of disturbing it is, and hold it in awareness as a mother might hold a child or a baby or a father, that you just like, it's just pure love. And you don't have to fall into the dualistic thinking, emoting and everything, but you can see it. And in that moment, that's a moment of liberation. It's not like you have to sit for 50 years and then you'll be liberated. And if you could teach it from that point of view, which is what I'm asserting. If you don't teach it from that point of view, it's not MBSR. It's more like a cognitive behavioral therapy. Then, if you teach it from that point of view, then the meditation practice does all the work. The Dharma does all the work, and you don't have to worry about the outcome.
But looking more broadly at mindfulness practice, which I think we now have millions of people doing mindfulness practice, not in the 8 week framework of MBSR, and therefore
Or
they
they
have
start in the 8 week framework and they just keep going for the rest of their life.
that's right. And so let me put this proposition to you that what is the liberative power of seeing things as they truly are? Well, as we discussed yesterday, in many ways, we misunderstand who we are. We misunderstand the actual nature of our world.
And
We
misapprehend.
we 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 suffer from fundamental cognitive errors that we make. So here's the question: when one does simply reside non-judgmentally in the full experience of what is in the present moment, as you suggest, is the basis of the practice. What do we discover about the nature of the present, about the nature of reality, both the reality of who we are and what the reality of our world is?
You're already whole. You already belong. You're part of much larger circles of wholeness. And you are both unique and not unique at the same time. And so basically, you're free to live life in a way that nurtures what's deepest and best and most satisfying in you. And at the same time, since you are also recognizing how easily we fall into those personal pronouns we spoke about and the whole domain of what we call selfing and self privileging, then realizing that we also cause a lot of harm in the world by privileging ourselves and, you know, pushing other people out of the way or whatever it is that we do, causing harm, and very often to the people we love the most, if we're talking about families and parenting and so forth. So that's why the practice isn't just sitting on the cushion. It's like how you are in relationship to your grandchild or your child or your elderly parent or to whatever is unfolding in life. That's the practice of the moment. And it's not to have some kind of an outcome or idealize, sort of relationship, but to be with the actuality of things as they are. And then there's one more thing that I think we need to introduce here, and that is that awareness is like what the physicists and the cosmologists might call a hidden dimension. Okay. We all have awareness. We all are awareness in a certain way, but we almost never apprehend it, realize it. And so it's a hidden dimension, much like they speak about in quantum physics and so forth. And it's the term that I use is orthogonal. As soon as you are aware, you're already inhabiting a dimension that was a moment before hidden from you. And that gives you new degrees of freedom to relate to the good, the bad, and the ugly.
And would it be fair to say that that awareness that is hidden from us often um, actually is who we truly are ultimately, as opposed to who we currently think we are?
Totally. Yeah. Thinking is fine, emotion's fine, but awareness like never gets any airtime. And we need to cultivate that because no matter how powerful thinking is, and it's really powerful, awareness trumps thinking every time because, you know, it's infinite. There's no center and there's no periphery to one's awareness. You can experiment, explore it yourself, see if you can find the center of your awareness, see if you can find the periphery. Even to say it's your awareness is absurd. So but then that means like we're in some sense we're infinite beings, and we're also, as we'll speak about the next time, we are the product of 13.8 billion years of evolution in this particular universe. And every atom in our body is part of that unfolding. And at a certain point, these atoms came together to create, amoebas and paramecia and then dinosaurs and us. And a certain degree of sentience arose so that like we actually, or awareness that we actually can be uh, very hard to define awareness even, but it's more than just paying attention. It's like, who are you really? So that's a good koan for us to probably leave this conversation in. And what my again Sun San used to say is when he would act that out, who what am I is like a particular kind of koan that they use in practice, like one of these Zen conundrums. And so, what am I or who am I? And then he'd sit up straight and close his eyes and he'd get a quizzical look on his face and he'd say, don't know. I don't know. And that not knowing, I mean, that's what all great scientists know what they don't know, because otherwise you'll never discover at the boundary of what's known and what's not yet known, but you have insight into. So this makes everybody a scientist in the most beautiful of ways and exploring the most important question of all, which is, who am I? What does it mean to be human?
And that inquiry and the insight that one could develop into who one is, I think ultimately gets at the deepest sources of suffering in the human condition, and as well as what is the nature of this world that I'm experiencing. But I want to ask you about potentially a third kind of knowledge or insight that develops through mindfulness practice, through being present non judgmentally with all of life as it is unfolding in the moment, which is the understanding on a more relative term of what causes us happiness and what causes us suffering. What causes happiness for ourselves and others, what causes suffering for ourselves and others, which then can extend into ethics, into passion, into community. And I think so. Would you talk for a moment about the being present, as it were, with and being able to see the factors, the decisions, the acts, the ways of thought that are beneficial to us as human beings and those that are not?
Well, what comes to mind when you frame it that way is that when one gets calm to a certain degree and gives oneself over to resting in awareness, as we've been speaking about, the first realization, so to speak, uh, is that is one of profound interconnectedness. That being a product of the universe, we're actually connected to everything else in the universe, everything. And not in a merely intellectual way, but just they kind of see that, again, we're connected to the atmosphere, right? Because we depend on it for this breath. And so when you see that you are part of a much, your whole yourself, WHOLE, which is the root meaning of the word health and healing and holy. So there's a lot of energy in that recognition that I'm okay, I'm whole, as I am, including all my warts and pimples and everything I think is wrong with me. Still, in some fundamental way, I'm whole. And yet, I'm part of larger and larger circles of wholeness. I didn't pop into reality by myself. I was actually born out of the body of a woman. We don't need to go any further than that to discuss miracle. I mean, we don't think about it that way, but it's like miraculous beyond imagination. And every one of us so far has been come into the world that way. So there's this element of mystery and beauty of being part of something much larger than ourselves. And then we were speaking about the personal pronouns. It's no longer about I, me, and mine, but it's much more about we and who we are and how we can, excuse me, live together, manage in such a way that we, as Thich Nhat Hanh like to say, inter-are with, say, the plant world and with the microscopic world, of zooplankton and phytoplankton, and which is taking care of at least 50% of the carbon in the atmosphere. That phytoplankton in the oceans absorbing carbon dioxide. So everything is interconnected with everything else, and we can realize this inwardly through meditation practice, outwardly through environmental science, which is happening now big time, and then wake up to all of the ways in which we're actually creating our own future generation suffering and present generation suffering by non-attending to simple things like the water supply for a third of the people in the world is going away because of global warming. So mindfulness is much bigger than, my particular pain in my knee or my particular grief in my heart. But it can start wherever you like, because it is actually the awareness is the entire enchilada, the entire curriculum of humanity on planet Earth. And then once we are aware or wake up, then the question is, okay, uh, how do we move from being into doing in a way that is informed by wisdom and compassion and non-harming?
Thank you, John. And that will be the subject of our third and final dialogue tomorrow, is effectively expanding out our understanding of the experience of mindfulness, of the life of mindfulness, to encompass others, to encompass how to behave in the world, to encompass the future of humanity, which is in many ways dire. And so I want to thank you for this conversation, John. Once again, as yesterday's, it's been a wise and inspiring mindfulness instruction in itself. And I personally have benefited from it, and I'm sure that everybody who is listening to this now has benefited from it. And we all really look forward to speaking for the third of these conversations. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.